stars be with you.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Energetic Principles podcast. We are back with episode 3 of our fall 2025 series that is loosely based on the impending Saturn Neptune conjunction from varying angles. And I'm so excited to have back on the program here today, Michael J. Morris. Thank you for joining me again. It's been some time.
It has. I'm so excited to be here, to be back in conversation with you, and yeah, just excited to see where the conversation takes us.
Yes. Do you recall? I mean, it's been a couple years at least, 2, 3 years. I feel like you posted a story not too long ago, and it shocked me with how long it had been since you had been on the program.
Yeah, it has been a few years. I think maybe it was, I don't know. I can
Yeah,
find
it's
it really
okay. I'm putting
quickly.
you on the spot. Time is, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but it gets very loose the older you get. I
Hmm.
swear, I blink and a decade's gone by. So I am so excited to have you back on the program where we are going to be talking about the topics of imagination, fantasy, and dreaming in relation to some of the astrological energies that we have coming up, but even in a broader stroke of what
Hmm.
these faculties that we are all born with and that we all participate in, whether we realize it or not, good old fantasy, is very important in life in general and the time that we are entering into. So, Michael, before we get started here, share a little bit about yourself with the listeners.
Yeah, well, my name is Michael J. Morris. My pronouns are they, them, their, and I am a queer feminist astrologer and tarot reader, an artist, a writer, and an educator. And yeah, as we were saying, I think this is my third time on the podcast, and I'm just really excited and grateful to be here and to be in conversation with you.
Yes, I as well. Because you always bring fascinating topics to the program
Aw,
that
thanks.
they expand my mind, and honestly, I'm just no shade to any other guests, but I Michael is up there with
Aw,
some of
thank
my
you.
favorite conversational partners. So well, without ado, let us get into our conversation here. Now, so, with all of the guests that are coming on with this series around Saturn Neptune, my thinking is what about this transit has you captivated or interested? And I am fascinated to see how many different angles are coming up with this. But one of the things that Michael brought to the forefront first, which I agree is very important to bring up, is about the Saturn Neptune, the impending conjunction. Dun dun dun. But it's not just an isolated moment in time, right? There's a little more to it. Michael, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about how we think about astrological time. That part of the practice of astrology is really giving us lots of different ways or approaches or dimensions through which to think about time and how time is unfolding or how we are unfolding through time. And one of the ways that we do that is through transits, which are for probably most people listening are familiar with transits, but just to say that transits are the movement of the planets in real time, usually in relation to something else, something like our birth chart, or to the chart at the starting of a nation, or the chart at the starting of some sort of project or process. And so we're thinking about where are the planets moving right now in relation to where they have been in the past. And so there's a way in which the unfolding of transits is always a process. And so when we're thinking about this upcoming Saturn Neptune conjunction, which will go exact in February 2026, it almost went exact in July 2025. It came within 14 minutes of exactitude. So we are potentially already moving into or moving towards some of the qualities associated with this time or with this planetary configuration. But then it will really kick off in February. And one of the ways that I like thinking about these planetary configurations is remembering, especially when we're talking about transits, that they are part of cycles, that this is not an isolated event. But when we're talking about the conjunction between two planets like Saturn and Neptune, we're talking about the end of one Saturn-Neptune cycle and the start of the next Saturn-Neptune cycle. So, for example, the last time Saturn and Neptune were conjunct was in Capricorn in 1989. So that's like, roughly that'll be about 27 years ago, or 37 years ago, whenever we reach this next conjunction. And then the next, after February 2026, the next Saturn-Neptune conjunction will be in Gemini in 2061. And so we can think about this conjunction as the start of a process that's going to be unfolding over several decades of our lives, of history, of our times. And so rather than thinking of this as like, oh, there's this big thing that's happening in February, we could think about something happening in February that is initiating a series of processes. And some of
Mm.
the qualities or themes that we might associate with those processes that will start to unfold at that conjunction. And one of the ways that I like to hold transits like this is just to remember that no one transit, or really no one timing factor in astrology, holds the entire story of a period or an era or an epoch. That, from my view, and I think this is fairly consistent with thousands of years of astrological tradition, that no one transit or timing factor holds um, everything that's unfolding during that time in the world or in our lives, that they are always unfolding in the context of other astrological events, longer periods, and many different moving parts through which we come to make meaning of the astrology of any period or moment. And so this conjunction is, we could think of it as maybe one story or
Mm.
one part of the story, but it's never going to be the whole story. And as we talk through some of the qualities and themes that we might associate with Saturn and Neptune coming together, we could think of what is this adding to the story, the collective story or the personal stories of our lives. Does that make some sense to
Oh, it
you?
makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And this essentially is the nuance of astrology is it's if it was only Saturn and Neptune having an influence, it would be only Saturn, Neptune, orbiting around the sun, and then that would be it. But we have all these other planets, we have all these other energies, even fixed star energies, and just the cycles of relation of the transits. And like you said, how do these transits relate to the birth chart? How do these transits relate to the progress chart or just progressions in general or Time Lord system? There's so many ways to look at it, not only in for our individual lives, but as you brought up earlier, more mundane considerations when we're thinking about nations or corporations or et cetera. Everybody is going through their own, to harken back to our last episode we did, relationship
Mhm.
with the planets. And I love that you brought this to the forefront because I think it is important to remember, especially when we are in a time where clickbait or strong headlines or that astrological YouTube video that's like Saturn Neptune is the end near? I'm just making it up, but like is the beginning of a new reality. And so honestly, I feel like I might have used the title or something like that at one time because vidIQ suggests it to me. They're like, you're not going to get anybody unless you make it more extreme. And honestly, it does feel a little cheesy because it's not. But it is the thing that's like people are like, what? Oh my, this
Mhm.
is coming. And so it becomes a tactic of
Yeah.
engagement or energy, and it is a big thing. And that's the thing, is that we don't necessarily need to take it incredibly lightly either, but as you said, there has to be context about
Mhm.
what the transit means, the fact that it's part of a cycle and that it's not isolated from any other thing that happens to be going on in the skies right now.
Yeah, exactly. I think what you're pointing to is so important, especially online, especially through things like social media or YouTube or podcasts. There's generally a strong focus on well, transits in general, partly because transits are maybe the easiest thing to talk about in a general way. The real-time movements of the planets in the sky is something that we are all technically experiencing at the same time, one way or another. And it's more difficult to create astrology or material or content that we put out into the world that's maybe relevant or applicable to everyone if we are talking about other timing techniques like secondary progressions, which can be very personal, or Time Lord techniques like annual perfections or zodiacal releasing or circumambulations through the bounds. These are all things that are very chart specific. So you can't, or it becomes much more complicated to make content that speaks to everyone if you're talking about things that are very chart specific. Whereas transits are something that's happening in real time for everyone. But oftentimes, and you were pointing to this as well, I think, in terms of the question of context, oftentimes on the internet, on social media, this astrology that's shared circulates without much context. And so people who are maybe new to astrology or maybe don't know much about astrology aren't always given maybe the tools or the resources or the literacy with which to assess or recognize what is likely to be more or less important, just in general, but
Mhm.
also more or less important personally. And that's something that I end up talking with clients about a lot because a lot of the clients who I work with do follow astrology on social media or on YouTube and things like that. And they'll come in and be like, Pluto just stationed direct. What does that mean for me? It's like, well, not much for you personally. It could be something that's descriptive of collective experiences, things that are happening in the world. But unless that transit is making a really specific aspect back to your natal chart, that's going to be pretty far down the list in terms of priorities of what we might think of as descriptive of that person's experiences or the events that are unfolding in their lives, which, as you said, does not mean it's not significant. Again, this Saturn Neptune conjunction only happens every few decades. So there is something significant to it, but how we understand or frame or contextualize its significance, I think, is part of what we're trying to set up here. Just holding it within a frame of this is relevant as a part of collective stories, and it will be relevant in different ways, maybe more
Mm.
or less relevant or significant when we get to the scale of the personal, of how this is actually interacting with or relating back to a specific chart, whether that's a person or a nation or a corporation or another project or something like that. That is where we start to see like, oh, is this Saturn Neptune conjunction going to be really descriptive of events in your life? Or is it more like the ambient celestial weather that we're kind of all moving through, but maybe there's things that could be more significant or specific that are happening in a person's own natal chart, for
Mhm.
example?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is important to have that rise to the surface of not only our talk here today, but the series as a whole, is the fact that these are quote unquote outer planets. You know, we have
Hmm.
a what would be maybe a social planet and a collective planet, and it's a larger cycle, and there are these collective movements going on. And as if you listened to the podcast before, you know, I'm always talking about the how the collective is just made up of a bunch of individuals. So we do have our individual essence to contribute to the collective, but I feel like there's something about these cycles, and maybe this speaks to what we're going to be talking about here today, that the given the astrological atmosphere that we're under within the cycle, you know, dying down and starting again, maybe it brings things forth that aren't acute to our lives
Hmm.
necessarily, but create space to maybe engage with life in a different way.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times, if you think about it, if someone gets, you know, sick, or if something happens to someone and it's, you know, it takes them down. Because sometimes astrology transits can be like that. And I'm not going to say like you'll get sick or it'll like, you know, have a crisis, but it's acute in the sense that you're like, oh, this is happening to my
Hmm.
life right now.
Hmm.
And there might be something about these transits or this transit that we're speaking here today in the start of the cycle that has more of a nebulous
Hmm.
effect that isn't like oh, this thing happened or this event took place or I'm having this, but we swirl within the energies of it. And then how do we recognize that? And maybe that's what we're doing here today is to help recognize the energy itself and how to engage with it. Because maybe if you're under Saturn as your time lord this year,
Mhm.
or maybe if you just happen to have placements at 0 degrees of Aries or or 0 degrees of cardinal signs, or the beginning
Mhm.
degrees of cardinal signs, you might feel this more acutely. But for a lot of us, not going to be the case. So, rest easy. When you always think of this thing of the other shoe's gonna, when's the other shoe gonna drop, or when's it coming for me?
Mm.
And it's not necessarily the case. But there can be heaviness that goes
Mhm.
with it because, as Michael stated when I asked, "How are you doing today?" And what was your response?
I said, well, I'm doing as well as I can be given all that's unfolding in the world right now. And a lot of what's happening in the world right now feels pretty catastrophic. And yet there are also things unfolding at the scale of my own life that, feel satisfying or meaningful or connect me to joy or pleasure or purpose. And both of these things can be true at the same time. And similarly, exactly as you said, like, if people have Saturn as one of the Time Lords in their chart right now, or if they have significant placements in the early degrees, especially around 0 to 1 degrees of the cardinal signs, they might experience this transit a little bit more personally, or it might take on greater personal significance. And yet also at the scale of the collective, this transit, this conjunction, this planetary configuration can describe qualities or themes to which we all might give our attention, things we might observe, and also maybe inspire us to consider our own actions or our behaviors or choices in particular ways as part of these collective stories, whether or not we're having really tight, acute aspects to our natal chart, for example. So both that personal scale and the collective scale, what's going on in the world, and also what's unfolding in my own life, and how can I be a participant at all of those scales.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Well, now that we have disclaimered the Saturn Neptune cycle here, let's get into Saturn and Neptune as far as their maybe archetypal energies and what the conjunction, I don't want to say what the conjunction means because there's not one meaning per se,
Mhm.
but maybe what we're going to extract here today within these two archetypes coming together. Because when we think of Saturn, we think of our institutions, the traditions that we have, the establishment that we are very used to, and the systems that are in place. And essentially any type of boundaries, whether they are within that system or things like borders for countries or uh, politics or who's in charge, that is all very Saturnian
Mhm.
by nature. And then we have Neptune coming around that is essentially the antithesis of that, which is more about uh, eroding what has
Mhm.
structure. And, I think about like mice in your house sort of thing. It's like it starts to gnaw on everything, and then, cords are cut and things break down, and there's just an erosion that takes place. And that might be why a lot of us are feeling this, maybe divine discontent with how things are in the world, because there is sort of this crumbling of our reality taking place before us. Um, but I want to hear more about your take on maybe the high side or, in relation to our dreams, fantasy, and imagination leaning today. Where do you think this transit can take us?
Well, as you said, there's never one meaning to really anything in astrology. It's something that I end up saying to students and clients a lot is that astrology is an inherently multivalent system, that everything in astrology always holds the potential or capacity to mean more than one thing. And actually, I think that's part of the beauty of astrology is that as we practice it, it gets us out of ways of thinking that might be concentrated or limited to there's only one truth here. There's only one perspective that astrology, by its very nature, practicing it, asks us to hold the complexity of more than one possibility, to pursue the trajectory of what else could be true.
Mhm.
And yeah, as you said, like with Saturn and Neptune coming together, there can be this dissolution or this erosion of things that have been established or that we've received from the past. Like when we go back to the ancient sources, Saturn is really consistently associated with things like the old and the aged, or inheritors or inheritance, as well as structure and limits and boundaries. And so we can think of it as maybe describing those social structures and systems and traditions that we've been given. And then, as you said, and then Neptune comes in, and it's almost like I think of it as a kind of tide coming in
Mm.
and eroding away those foundations or those structures of what has been established in the past. And there's a number of different ways we might see that happening or coming together. Um, One way is that some of the existing systems that maybe we're already familiar with might be coming apart or coming undone. And this is maybe um, what did the language you use, the kind of divine discontent of
The
the moment
divine
that we're living.
discontent, yes.
Yeah, and it's like it makes me think of things happening here in the US, like the elimination of the Department of Education or the gutting of Medicaid and other forms of federal funding for healthcare, or the gutting of federal funding for the arts, or the erosion of our rights, things like the hard-won rights for transgender people, or the rights of immigrants, or even assaults on birthright citizenship, which was established as an amendment to the Constitution in the 1800s. So these are like things we've received that are established. Like this is what is true for us. And we're watching many of those things erode and come apart and dissolve and kind of get washed away. And we're left kind of picking up the pieces. And as you pointed to, and actually, I'll just gesture there that all of those examples I named, yes, are located in the US. That's where we're recording. They're examples that are familiar to me, which is not to say that this conjunction is only relevant to US politics or to life in the United States. But it is maybe worth noting, not as a point that we need to pursue strongly, but that this conjunction is happening within 18 minutes of the IC in the US Sibley chart. So, in terms of the chart for the founding of this country, there actually is a very important angle at 1 degree of Aries, just at the beginning of 1 degree of Aries. And this conjunction is happening within 18 minutes of it. So it's not surprising to me as people living in the US that we are already seeing those kinds of structures and institutions eroding and coming apart, specifically at the foundation
Mhm.
of much of what it means to be a person or to be a citizen of this country. That this we can see already the ways that this transit is coming into effect here, specifically because of its relationship to the chart of the founding of the country. But as you gestured toward, there are also um, liberatory possibilities for this conjunction, ways in which this transit could be um, pointing towards new possibilities of where else we might go from here. And one of those directions we might consider is around imagination. And
Mm.
one of the ways that I think about that is Tusar of Babylon, who was writing in the first century BCE. Um, he's one of the oldest surviving sources that we have for this astrological tradition that really came out of a synthesis of Babylonian and Egyptian astrology. And Tusar of Babylon describes Saturn as without imagination. And yet, imagination is one of the primary keywords that we have associated with Neptune since its discovery. And so we can see that there's a pretty clear tension
Yeah.
between these planets around the topic of imagination. And one of the ways that I think about imagination or the role of imagination in our lives comes from a writer named Adrienne Maree Brown, who gives us some ways of thinking about imagination in a book that she wrote called Emergent Strategy. And Adrienne Maree Brown writes, "We are in an imagination battle. We must imagine new worlds that transition ideologies and norms so that no one sees Black people as murderers or brown people as terrorists and aliens, but all of us as potential cultural and economic innovators. This is a time travel exercise for the heart. This is collaborative ideation. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us?"
Mm.
And I love that quote so much because it reminds us that everything that we've been given as concrete consensus reality, all of these established traditions and institutions and structures and policies, they all began as something that someone or someone's imagined. And in turn, we have to be able to imagine any kind of other world or other future that we might work together to create. And this framing of imagination as a kind of battle, an imagination battle, Adrienne writes. It makes me think of the ways we're seeing so much of that unfold right now in the world, or again, here in the US. I'm thinking about the ways that we are currently living in an imagination battle in which someone has imagined that immigrants are criminals. And now they are making that imagination a reality by criminalizing immigrants. Or we're living in an imagination battle in which transgender people are imagined to be violent terrorists, despite the well-documented facts that mass shooters in the United States from 1966 to the present are overwhelmingly cisgender men and majority white. And that's according to the SUNY Rockefeller Institute of Government. We are also living in an imagination battle in which Black and brown people are killed with impunity by police because Blackness has been imagined to be coextensive with threats of danger, even when the victims are unarmed, even when the victims are innocent and have committed no crimes. And we're living in an imagination battle in which Jewish people criticizing the state of Israel are imagined to be anti-Semitic, or in which tax cuts to billionaires are imagined to benefit the working class, or in which the climate isn't collapsing, and in which we have no responsibility to change industrial practices that are hurtling this planet towards greater inhospitability and so on. I'm just using this list of
Yeah, I
examples of
mean, there are tons. I love the concept of imagination battle because really the other side of the coin that we're coming up against here is still imagination. It's just imagination in a way that, well, is not true in many respects. Because these are all imagined slights of, criminalizing immigrants and criminalizing, Black people and transgenders. But the reality of it is that if you really look into it, there's very little criminal behavior that actually lives there. And so that is a source of imagination. And so the
Mhm,
question I want to ask is, how can imagination be used for the good of all people?
mhm.
Um, and then where does is our imagination in the Saturnian limit, the no imagination, not allow for imagination to be expanded to include all? I don't know if
Yeah,
that makes any sense, but
definitely it makes sense. Well, I think it's part of what Adrienne Maree Brown is pointing us towards in terms of um, moving us toward collective ideation. What are the things that we can come to imagine or think about or pursue collectively together, not only in my own ideas, but also like with one another. She also calls it a time travel exercise of the heart, this idea of traveling to perhaps future possible worlds in our hearts or in our imaginations.
hmm,
How else could we imagine the world to be? And then how do we m- make that imagination that we are time traveling into more of a reality or a new kind of reality. If we're watching the ways, all of these different ways in which someone or someones have imagined the world to be, and then they are making that imagination more real by legislation, by executive orders, by um, police policies, by all of the ways in which ideas start to have concrete material consequences for how we live our lives. How do we participate in that process? How do we not only imagine the world or future worlds as it could be or how else it could be, but then also what are the steps that we take together to make those possible worlds more of a reality? And I think that is something that this Saturn-Neptune conjunction and the cycle that unfolds from that conjunction really presents as an ideal time of if we think about the conjunction as the starting point, all right, then what are the seeds for new possible worlds that we want to be imagining right now? And then as this cycle unfolds, how does that imagination exert a kind of pressure into action such that it becomes more real? And that's where we can see the relationship of Neptune and Saturn coming together of whatever we imagine shapes what will become real in the same way that everything that has become real in the world as it is started as a way that someone imagined the world could be. And so we are always participants in that process, in that project. And I like this cycle, this Saturn Neptune cycle, as one maybe context or framework through which we can think about our participation in those processes.
Absolutely. Because what's coming to mind for me is thinking about coming back to what you were saying earlier about Saturn being, attributed from antiquity to be the planet of no imagination.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes when we see stark realities or are aligned too closely, or there's no room or we're boxed in by what feels like a stark reality, it's almost impossible to imagine anything else. And so it's almost like a horse with blinders on, where the point, the field of vision just gets more narrow and more narrow
Mhm.
and more narrow. And to me, imagination is about the expansion of, a 360 view. This is like virtual reality almost, in the sense where, or maybe like lucid dreaming. I don't know if you've ever had a
Mhm.
lucid dream
Yeah.
where you can just kind of wake up and look around, and anything is sort of possible to jump into your field of vision. But when we are in this no imagination state, especially if we're overwhelmed by the
Mhm.
state of the world and really actually the implementation of other people's imaginations, and then
Mhm.
they become our reality, how can we step back from that so that we can realize that each and every one of our imaginations are so powerful, so much so that we can glom on to other people's imaginary gifts, yeah, or not gifts
Mhm.
per se, but perspectives.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that whole, what Adrienne is saying here about imagining new worlds where no one sees Black people as murderers.
Mhm.
Like, honestly, that that quality is just so ingrained, especially here in the
Mhm.
US, that I'll be walking home at night or something, and I will see, if I see, a person of color, and I love all people, like I don't have fear, but there will be this fear that rushes to me, and I'll immediately question myself. I'm like, why is
Mhm.
this coming up? And I think it's because it's so pervasive in
Yeah.
like the zeitgeist, or what, the world that we've imagined into being, that even though it's not my personal belief, it will still hit or affect me in a
Mhm.
way where I have to question that within myself and be like, I don't believe that, or that's not what I imagined to have. And so sometimes I feel like it's not even maybe the like originating from my own imagination,
Right.
but living within the one that, the bubble that's been created over Saturn centuries, right?
Yes. Exactly. I mean, I think that's such a good example, and it makes me think of a couple of other things. It makes me think of Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which is really about how a racial caste system has been established and maintained and perpetuated throughout the history of the US, and all of these tools and strategies, including the proliferation of fear that has been part of the maintenance of those racial caste systems, such that it's not an accident that so much of our media, so much of our television programs, even going back to before television, into what was reported in the news and how, and what was not reported in the news and how, to create a view that Black and brown people are inherently dangerous. And this goes all the way back to the institution of chattel slavery in the United States and the presentation of Black and brown people as less than human, as not people, as wild animals that had to be controlled or tamed. So there's a long history to how these cultural imaginations make their way not only into our world, but also into us. And then our responsibility, exactly as you're saying, to interrupt that and say, actually, that's not true. I was taught that. I've been conditioned to think and even feel that way, but that is not a reality. That is someone else's imagination that I have been told is real, but is in fact not real. And that makes me think also of another signification of Saturn, that when we go back to the ancient sources, Saturn is very consistently associated with the themes of prisons, imprisonment, and incarceration. So when you're talking about this like narrow, locked in view that doesn't allow any sort of space for thinking or imagining the world to be otherwise, I just think about being this locked
Mm,
into or imprisoned in the ideas that we've been given or the ideas that we've been taught or conditioned to believe are true. And if I follow that thread, even just a little bit of the incarceration or the prison, it makes me think of Angela Davis in, I think it was in Are Prisons Obsolete? She talks about the ways that the prison industrial complex in the United States presents itself as if it is permanent and inevitable. And yet we know not only is it not inevitable because it has not always existed, we also know it is not permanent because it was built. If it
yeah.
was built, it can be unbuilt. And so maybe another way we can think about this Saturn Neptune conjunction is asking ourselves what possibilities emerge when that which has been presented as permanent and inevitable starts to dissolve or erode. Or, and we can think about that at the scale of the collective, but also in our own lives. What have we come to believe is permanent or inevitable? And what happens when we question those things? What if it's not permanent? Think about all the things we've been told about ourselves by our families, by society, probably by teachers in our education, that we start to believe. Like, this is who I am. This is how I always will be. And what possibilities open up when we question the inevitability of those stories? What possibilities open up when we question the permanence of who we have been told we have to be or who we have been told we can only be? And we
Mm,
start to move into other possibilities for who else we could be or become. And we can do that at the scale of our own lives. We can do that at the scale of our societies as well, looking around and asking what has been presented to us or given to us or established, to use one of those other Saturn words, what has been established or constituted as permanent and inevitable? And how might this be a time for questioning whether or not that's true? And
mm,
imagining what other possibilities might be if, in fact, this is not permanent, if, in fact, this is not inevitable, if the violences that we're seeing unfolding in the world and in our country right now, what if they are not inevitable? What if it didn't have to be this way? That is an exercise of imagination. I have one more quick thought, and then I'll take a breath here.
I'm
Getting
loving that. It's
fired
so
up.
relevant. Give.
I'm thinking about, I mentioned the gutting of the funding for the arts in the United States right right now. And, you know, as a dancer, as a choreographer, as someone with multiple degrees in dance, many of my communities are artists. Many of them are independent artists. And I'm just watching this moment unfolding in our country where making art is becoming much more difficult. To have a sustainable life or a career making art is being undercut severely right now. And I think that is not an accident. I think that the suppression of the arts is one way that we suppress our capacities for imagination.
Yes.
If an entire generation grows up with less access to art and artistic practices and learning about their own creativity and their own creative potential, then um, that subverts their capacities to imagine the world otherwise and to just accept the world that has been given as permanent and inevitable because they don't have the tools or resources to imagine the world otherwise. So I guess I'm trying to off the cuff kind of make a connection here between the arts and imagination, and that the arts are one of the ways that we support and cultivate and generate greater capacities for imagination in our lives and in our societies.
Absolutely. That's where when you were saying that, well, because first let me just say that some of the things that you were bringing up in relation to being, well, I guess we were talking about imprisonment, but also just, being so locked into
Mhm.
an ideology or essentially a story that we have been told of what reality looks like, and especially on a very personal level, because this is actually something that I have been wrestling with lately, is that, and it actually has to do with, more of like a caste system or a class system, where I think there was a part of me that was very like, oh, I just am in this bracket.
Mhm.
And I will always be in this bracket. And it's just, I don't want to say it's a trivial way of looking at it because I'm just looking at some money and living, but as a very practical example here, my partner was like, well, why do you think that way? And
Right.
he literally was like, dream with me. Like, if
Yes.
you won't dream with me, like you're, and I love bringing about the relationship is if you won't dream with me, then that is not only not helping you, but it's not helping us. And if
Right.
we take that on a collective level, it's not helping anybody if we
Mhm.
aren't able to expand into an alternative reality than the one that we live in, and a higher one at that. The thing with Neptune is Neptune lives in the world, one facet of Neptune lives in the world of ideals, right?
Mhm.
And where anything might be possible. And some might say that you're to for lack of better words, you're crazy. That can't possibly be, or that would never happen. But like you said before, anything that has ever happened is because someone has imagined this up, right?
Yes.
And what you were saying in relation to the arts and criticism there, or lack of funding, or a strangling of what can be, I mean, funded or shared just in
Mhm.
general. I mean, we all know in what sort of societies art gets taken down and what leads, politically speaking. So it is very important to for the arts to get out there. And even though if they are cut off or strangled, the thing is that art lives within the artist.
Yes.
Dance lives within the dancer.
Yeah.
Music lives within the musician. It will never be suppressed. It can't be.
Yeah.
And that's when things go underground, or that's when
Mhm.
things take a almost an even a more imaginative
Mhm.
turn where you have, you're not going to let the man get you down. So I agree with you. Having these things happen is very unfortunate, and we don't want to live in that world because it does siphon off the imagination of people and what the world can be if we're all just in this cookie cutter box that's meant
Mhm.
to go to this job to make this money for this person, and then we're all just programming computers at that point. But I don't think no matter how much it is attacked, it just will never. It's like
Mhm.
it'll still spread. So I maybe that's where my imagination lives. I'm like,
Yes, exactly.
it'll always live.
Well, and I agree with that. I think there's no way that you can fully suppress art or artistic practices. The effort is being made, and as you said, it's making it more difficult of what can be made or what can be presented. And artists will always be making work, and that's part of what is threatening to totalitarian or authoritarian fascist regimes. This idea that there will always be this creative impulse that points us towards other possibilities. And I think that pointing towards other possibilities maybe moves us toward the direction of fantasy, which is another
Mm.
idea that we associate with Neptune. And there's a quote that is my favorite quote about fantasy that comes from probably my favorite philosopher, Judith Butler. And Butler writes, fantasy is a part of the articulation of the possible. It moves us beyond what is merely actual and present into a realm of possibility, the not yet actualized or the not actualizable. Fantasy is not the opposite of reality. It is what reality forecloses, and as a result, it defines the limits of reality, constituting it as its constitutive outside. The critical promise of fantasy, when and where it exists, is to challenge the contingent limits of what will or will not be called reality. Fantasy is what allows us to imagine ourselves and others otherwise. It establishes the possible in excess of the real. It points elsewhere, and when it is embodied, it brings the elsewhere home.
Mm.
So, in other words, part of what they're framing for us here is that fantasy is a strategy for articulating what could be possible beyond what has been actualized or made actual. Um, Possibilities beyond what we've been told is real or could be real. Maybe even possibilities that we've been told are impossible. And I just even I mean I've read this quote hundreds of times, but because of the conversation we're having now, I'm again thinking about the role of the arts in this. That part of the role of the arts is to point elsewhere and then to bring that elsewhere home, to embody it in some concrete form, whether that's through movement and gesture or painting or music or poetry or some other practice that gives us a felt concrete experience, sensorial experience of an elsewhere or otherwise,
Mm.
that the world could be different. And we have evidence of it right here in this dance, in this song, in this poem, in this painting. And all of that we might think of as an exercise of fantasy that Butler even says that fantasy where's that part? Allows us to imagine ourselves and others otherwise. So there's a relationship between fantasy and imagination. And fantasy here is not merely what's not real, it's actually a kind of critique of what has been called real. It is a critique of the limits that we've been given to reality. Fantasy says, actually, maybe that's not true because I can imagine another set of possibilities for myself, for my body, for my gender, for my relationships, for my communities, for my world. I can imagine it. I can fantasize about that. And in the fantasy, I have this felt, embodied experience of what it could be to live otherwise. And that makes me think of so many things, art, but also magic, like the how crucial in at least all of my practices as a witch, as someone who works with magic,
Mm.
how crucial it is to be able to feel in my own body what it is I am working with or toward. That if I am creating a ritual or a spell um, for my people to be free, for example, to be able to feel in my body, what would it feel like to live in a world where my people are free, not only as an idea, but to
Yeah.
feel it. I mean, that's where this quote comes to at the end is that fantasy points elsewhere. And when it is embodied, it brings that elsewhere home. And that's, I think, the foundation of magic. I think it's the foundation of artistic practices. I think it's deeply interrelated with the ideas of imagination that Adrienna Maree Brown articulated in Emergent Strategy. And there's world changing potential when we allow fantasy to function in this way, to not just be like a distraction or escapism, which are other words that sometimes get used for Neptune, that fantasy can be that. It can be just escapism. But what happens when we tap into this critical creative potential of fantasy to gesture toward other possible realities? And I think that this Saturn Neptune conjunction and subsequent cycle is a spectacular time to be asking ourselves, what have we been given as the limits of what is real or possible? And how might our fantasies illuminate or generate pathways beyond such limits?
Hmm. Well, definitely something to consider in context of Aries. I
Hmm.
mean, when we think of Aries as a sign, as being a pioneering quality, where the maybe not the birth energies of Cancer per se, but it has that the the spark, the fire, the ignition that can get something off the ground, create new beginnings. That is absolutely the high side of this transit, is how that can
Mhm.
we take these Neptunian principles of imagination, of fantasy, and to, like you said, bring them home, embody them in some way. And that's where Saturn comes
Hmm.
in. And a lot of times to do that, there has to be a trade-off if we think about Saturn being in fall in Aries. And it's the
Right.
idea of the crumbling or the falling away. If we do want to entertain something that is completely new, a lot of times what the foundation we stand upon, even if it's in our own realities, has to crumble in some way so that we can imagine what will be or to
Hmm.
fantasize what comes next. But I love that you were bringing up this quality of embodiment with
Hmm.
the fantasy process, and actually what makes it different. What makes a difference from fantasy leading us to home and embodiment versus the idea of maybe getting lost in daydreams or escapism in some way, because that side of fantasy can just have us very, four of cups energy, where you're
Hmm.
just kind of just like looking off, and you're not really satisfied with what is, or maybe you're just off in a daydream about what could be. But there will never be action. There'll never be, think about being Mars sign, right?
Hmm.
Mars requires action of us, from us, and that can then in turn allow it to be embodied and to have the courage to engage with what the fantasy would look like if we were to just take a risk.
Hmm.
And a lot of times when we think about artists and their people, anybody that puts themselves out there, they are inevitably taking some sort of risk. Even if you think
Yes.
they're the most confident person that you've ever seen, or they just have the pizzazz or the sparkle and it's just in them. They're a natural. Anybody that puts themselves out there, whether it is in an artistic sense or just about changing their lives, right? You think about Cardinal being a
Hmm.
pivot point.
Hmm.
It takes guts, it takes courage to get the glory, right? So if we
Hmm.
align with the fantasy and that we imagine what could be, the only way we're going to ever realize it is to bring it home within us. And that takes courage, and it also takes practice. And so, what
Hmm.
you were bringing up before with, say, the ritual,
Hmm.
and if you dabble in witchcraft or spell making or anything that you have your altar at home, it is so powerful to keep showing up for the thing that only lives inside your mind,
Hmm.
and to bring it as if, they always say, imagine it as if you already have it.
Yes. Yes,
There's something to
exactly
be
that.
said for that.
Yes. Exactly that. I mean, I think um the bringing the elsewhere home into the body, into the felt sense. I'm so excited by the way that you're bringing the qualities of Aries into how we're thinking about this as well. Both the cardinality of Aries in terms of its starting point, the initiatory quality of, in the northern hemisphere, Aries marking the spring equinox and that being the start of springtime and all that grows and flourishes during that time. But it's the beginning of not even the harvest season, it's the beginning of growth. New things start to happen during that time. And I also love that you brought in the essential dignity of Saturn being in its fall in Aries, and not only what has existed maybe falling away, but also if we can think about the relationship between fall and exaltation, that exaltation is about what's elevated, what's lifted up, what's celebrated, what's given great attention. And often what's fallen is what is maybe overlooked or
Mm.
misunderstood or misrepresented or maybe even neglected in some way. And perhaps this could be an ideal time, particularly because this conjunction is happening in Aries and Saturn is in its fall in Aries. This could be a time to ask, what are the fantasies that we've maybe overlooked or that have been suppressed or denigrated in some way? What are the fantasies that we've maybe misunderstood or neglected in some way because other ideas, other fantasies, other imaginations have been elevated,
Mm.
because other things have been lifted up or exalted or celebrated. And because of that, we've neglected all of these other possibilities. And that's one of the ways that I generally think about fall, a planet in fall, even when I'm doing client work, is yes, it can describe personal experiences of being misunderstood or neglected in some way. And it can also point us towards what are the other possibilities that maybe have not been celebrated in mainstream normative society? What are the other possibilities that have been overlooked or misunderstood? And how might that planet be pointing us towards those kinds of possibilities? And
Mm.
imagination can be one of the tools towards that kind of contemplation. Fantasy can be one of the tools towards that contemplation. And then also dreaming. Our dreams can be part of our one of the tools or strategies in acknowledging what other possibilities there might be. And one of the quotes that I love about dreams and dreaming comes from Toni Morrison. And she's talking about dreaming here, and she says, not the activity of the sleeping brain, but rather the activity of a wakened, alerted one. Not idle, wishful speculation, but engaged, directed daytime vision. We must do all we can to imagine the other before we presume to solve the problems work and life demand of us. Dream the world as it ought to be. Imagine what it would feel like not to be living in a world loaded with zero life weapons manned by people willing to lose them, develop them, or store them for money or power or data, but never for your life and never for mine. What would it be like to live in a world where the solution of serious, learned people to practically every big problem was not to kill somebody? And so, like Brown's description of imagination and Butler's description of fantasy, Morrison describes dreaming as an awakened, alert state. Again, as we were pointing to, not wishful speculation or escapism, but engaged, directed, daytime vision, dreaming the world as it ought to be. And specifically, part of what she's pointing to here is imagining a world that is not structured around weapons and killing and greed, which I was about to say, we see so much happening right now. We've probably seen that happening as long as I've been alive. It seems to be the dominant dream of at least this country, of the United States, is structuring our world around weapons and killing and greed. And so, how do we as she said, how do we dream the world as it ought to be? Imagine what it would feel like, again, bringing it back to the body, what it would feel like to live in a world that wasn't like that. And then she also points to the importance of imagining another or others, the importance of imagining the other, which feels like a strategy of something like empathy,
Mm,
which is to say, like, to imagine another or others is not to say that you fully understand what it is like to be them or for them to move through the world, but it is to make an effort to try to imagine what it would be like to be someone other than yourself. And in that effort of imagination, we become more capable of recognizing the life of another as valuable, as relevant, as significant, that person as a person, not because we fully understand their internal world or that we have access to their full lived experience, but just in the effort to try to imagine the world from another person's perspective or experience gets us outside of ourselves. And that I think is also maybe related to qualities I associate with Neptune, the blurring of the boundaries, the dissolving or the eroding of the sense of separation of me as a autonomous, hyper individual self separated from everyone else, such that I become my own only priority. And instead, in this act of imagination, realizing our inherent interconnectedness, perhaps, or at the very least, the possibility that we could live our lives with an intentional imagination of how our lives are part of other people's lives, how what we choose and what we do affects or impacts other people's ability to live or to live well. And that being part of this practice of imagination and dreaming that Toni Morrison is pointing us toward.
absolutely. Because when you're speaking, I think about, as you brought up, this quality of empathy and the dissolving of the boundaries that come with Neptune. And another word we might hear around Neptune is compassion to some
Mhm.
extent. And that's essentially empathy. I would say empathy and compassion can be intertwined, maybe not
Mhm.
always, but they definitely tend to be. And it's interesting is because it's a quality of being compassionate for the other, but in order to be compassionate for the other, you also have to be compassionate for yourself.
Yeah.
And in order for them both to be present, because I think a lot of people, if we bring back sort of the Saturnian quality and some of the things that we were talking about before, of like not being able to stretch the imagination or the fantasy, is that so many of us live with an inner critic for
Mhm.
whatever reason. And when we don't have compassion for ourselves, it's very hard to have compassion for other people because we are not able, if we can't show it to ourselves, or sometimes people show it to themselves or other people and they don't give it to themselves at all, But I really think there's a connection with being able to hold like a new compassionate stance that's not
Mhm.
only for the other but for the self, and realize that, you know, ha- um, you know, stepping into someone else's shoes or seeing yourself in a kinder light, that is some form of protection, right? If we think about Saturn being maybe protection or conserving, it protects in a particular way, right? When we
Mhm.
create laws around something or we conservation acts, um, how can that and maybe like active compassion if we think about the Aries quality,
Mhm.
where it's not like, oh, I'm just feeling this for you or myself here. It's like, no, what am I going to do about it? Maybe I will
Mhm.
go donate here or help organize something or act in a different way that then is living out that compassion. Um in Yeah, so it's such a it's such a key thing that is missing right now for so
Mhm.
many people, and why we are in the state that we're in when we think about, you brought up Saturn earlier, and Saturn being aligned with prisons, and we think about
Mhm.
like how many people are being thrown in detention centers,
Yep.
and why is that? Is because there is this you know the alternative dream that Tony's bringing up about the power, the money, the data, because there's big money in prison systems. There's big
Mhm.
money in locking people up. There's big money in war. And if we were to pivot to a compassionate way of looking at things, a compassionate way of being embodied and feeling, would industry crumble? At least in
Mhm.
America, perhaps. And so it's almost like the hands are tied by the people that run. They're not tied. No, they're not, because we're thinking about fantasy and imagination
Yep.
here.
Yep.
But it's almost in order to open the door to that, it's a complete crumbling of very wrong things, personally speaking.
Mhm. Yeah, wrong things and very much, I mean, circling way back to what we were talking about toward the beginning, the crumbling of the world that has been given to us as if this is the only possibility,
Yes.
as if the world has to be this way. It is permanent, it is inevitable, whether we're talking about prisons or industries or national borders or wars, like we have to go to war. There's no other choice. This is just what we do. We, as long as I have been alive, this country has been directly or indirectly engaged in some form of international conflict. It is undeniably a national obsession. And if we believe that, well, it just has to be this way, then somehow we're ignoring the, hundreds of countries in the world that are not at war
Right?
perpetually,
Yeah.
which is, I think, enough of evidence to support or fuel our capacities for fantasy and imagination that like it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to be locking up people in detention centers. We don't have to be the country who there are more people in prisons in the United States than any other country in the world. Like that alone should be like, oh, there's plenty of evidence that it doesn't have to be this way, if for no other reason is we're not the largest country in the world. So why are there more people
Yeah.
incarcerated here than anywhere else? And it's not because people are more dangerous or more violent here than other places. It could be because people are criminalized at higher rates because of things like poverty, because of things like homelessness or houselessness, because of mental health crises, because of addiction. There's so many ways that we criminalize people who are struggling to survive because, exactly as you pointed to, there's profit in it. There is profit to be generated if we lock people up. And so the work here that I think we're pointing to through this whole conversation is asking ourselves and one another and, anyone listening to imagine that it doesn't have to be this way, even if it has been this way our whole lives. Or even if we've been told over and over and over again, directly and indirectly, this is just the way things are. Well, Neptune and Saturn coming together has the potential to erode those assumptions, to question the certainty of that or the validity of those claims, and to generate greater capacities for imagining a world otherwise. And that part that Adrienne Maree Brown pointed to, doing so, and you were even talking about this in terms of the relational dynamic with your partner, not just doing it on our own, but being engaged in collaborative ideation, that these ideas, these imaginations, these fantasies, these dreams become more possible when we do them together, when we share those ideas with others and we find, oh, you want to live in a world that's no longer structured by domination, oppression, and violence? I too want to live in a world that's no longer structured by domination, oppression, and violence. Let's imagine not only that world, but what are the concrete steps that it would take to get from here to there? If we can feel it in our bodies, what that would feel like. What does that feeling guide us toward? What are the next steps? whether that's organizing, whether that's donating to organizations, as you were pointing to, whether that's people running for office. One of my dear friends right now is running for city council in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, because, you know, he believes that another world is possible and he
Yeah.
believes that we could do better for the people living here. And so he's running for office. That's not something we're all going to do, but it's something someone can do, that people can do. And then also, apart from these existing systems of governance, of structures and institutions, I think what I find most interesting as an artist, as an astrologer, as a writer, is what are the ways that we can create life with and for one another, despite what these institutions say is real or is permanent, or that this is the way that things are. And it makes me think of the ways that, specifically just in terms of my communities, that queer and trans people have done this over and over and over again. Like every time that there are these um, authoritarian assaults on our ability to um, exist in public life, let alone affirm our desires and our sexualities and our genders and our relationships. Um, Similarly to how we were talking about artists earlier, there has never been a time where there were no queer people. There has never been a time where the suppression of gender variance or gender diversity has ever been successful. Sometimes it goes underground, sometimes it goes to other countries, sometimes it finds a way to continue. And the point I'm trying to make here is we get to make lives with and for one another regardless of anyone trying to regulate or restrict or suppress those lives. And that collective, collaborative ideation, the imagining together, the being in shared fantasies with one another, the dreaming another world with one another is part of how we make that a reality.
100%. Don't let the man get you down.
Hmm.
Because, we that and that's the beauty of communities, and that
Yeah.
we're all, even if you're in a community that is attempting to be suppressed or has always been suppressed.
Hmm.
It's like the power of engaging with other people and imagining what could be and creating that. I mean, part of
Yes.
the imagination we're saying and the embodiment of that is creating a new reality. And maybe it's not global by scale. Maybe it's not put into laws that have this or set these rules or these standards. Sometimes it's just the creation of the community around you or the resources that you have that you engage with or the relationships that you call at the end of the day or you meet in group and you feel alive and fulfilled. Because really at the end of the day, to go back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this conversation, is that collective reality, although it is very important, doesn't always have to always match up with what our lived reality is
Hmm.
here in the present, in our own bodies and in the immediate people and, environment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
So very like maybe Pluto and Aquarius and sort of the Aquarian energy here. It's like let's put our focus there because sometimes with imagination, it's almost like imagination and fantasy and dreaming is very big and it's very vast.
Mm.
But in Saturnian realms, we have to start small.
Yeah.
We have to start small, actionable, practical, and then let it blossom through
Hmm.
consistency.
Hmm. Yeah, I
So,
think that's so important, and it's that can become a daily practice.
yes.
If I imagine the world could be this way, what can I do today that is in alignment with that world? Not in alignment with the world as it's been given or in alignment with the world as I've been told it has to be, but what would I do today? What small action, what small step could I take, especially with other people, that is as if that world that I imagine is possible is in fact possible? What would I then do? And that can happen in so many small ways, small, practical, concrete ways. And all of those ways together is how we make those things more real. And I also, this is a quick thought. Um, you gestured towards the, like, even if it's not like made global or put into law, things like that. And even if we had like a much longer conversation, we would could probably examine how even those larger systems and structures, they've never been fully coherent.
Yeah.
They fall apart in all kinds of ways. I'm thinking about, particularly in the US right now, how many states and federal laws are in contradiction right now. Like, so actually, even at the large scale of these systems, there's always been rupture. There has always been fracture and space for other possibilities to emerge, even as we are told that's not the case. This is fully and always the way that things are, which sounds, like totalizing or totalitarianism. And even in those systems, we can see how totalitarianism as a political structure, every time it's been attempted to be implemented, has fallen apart because there will always be resistance, there will always be rupture, there will always be deviations and points of breakdown within anything that claims to always and everywhere be true. That's never been the case. And so we're working at these spaces of rupture or disruption or breakdown or possibility inside of the systems and structures that we've been told are only and always this way.
Mm,
And we're doing that, as you said, in small, practical, concrete ways every day that make those things more real.
that's how we do it, the Saturn way.
Yes.
Oh my goodness, Michael. Well, I feel like we have done a solid treatment with the help of Toni and Judith and Adrienne on fantasy, imagination, dreams from all the varying realities. A lot to process, a lot to dream about. Just a
Mhm.
little heads up for the folks that want to do that dreaming and that practice that we're talking about. Those first 5 minutes when you're waking up, that liminal state, put your mind there. Think about some of the things that we were talking about in the fantasy that you want to see for this world. That's that precious little space. Engage with it. It doesn't have to be a big ordeal.
Mhm.
Just start it as your first thing and let it permeate your day.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, where can people find you? What do you have going
Hmm.
on?
People can find me at my website, which is michaeljmorris.co. They can also find me on Instagram at co-witchcraft-offerings. Um, And what do I have going on? On my website, people can book astrology and tarot consultations. That's my primary work, and that's where people can do that, is on the bookings page on my website. I also offer one-on-one tutoring and mentorship for students of astrology who are looking to, I don't know, looking for support in deepening or developing their own practices or their studies in some way. And then on my website, I also have a number of recordings of past presentations and workshops that I've given that are available there as well, which include topics like queer sexualities in ancient astrology, or transits and transgender liberation movements, or multiple presentations in various ways about feminist astrology, or which we actually did. Had a conversation about many years ago. I think it was like
Yeah.
2020.
Yeah.
Um, there's a couple of workshops on working with asteroids in the birth chart and in ritual, or astrology in the body, or astrology as an artistic practice, and
Mm.
more. There's more things there too, but those are some things that people can find on my website. And what about you? Where can people find you, and what do you have going on?
What do I have going on? Well, you can find me at energeticprinciples.com, and you can also find me at tarotofher.com. And speaking of Tarot of Her, we are about to launch our second edition Kickstarter,
Hmm.
which this is where I need imagination and I need positive fantasy, because we have been dragging our asses on this thing for so long because of this stinking tariff situation. Because we do
Mhm.
have our deck made in China. I have a fabulous relationship with a wonderful manufacturer over there. And right when I get the pre-launch page going, it's like Trump has threatened 100% tariff on
Mhm.
China. And I'm like, you. Ugh.
Mhm.
But you know what? In Aries fashion, I'm going to proceed. Sarah Jane and I are going to proceed with courage knowing that the deck is ready to get back out there and many people want it. And we have now
Mhm.
have an expansion pack to go with it. And so I will not be afraid or intimidated by the man. And yes, so we are gearing up for a launch on October 24th. So if you have had any interest in the deck or you don't know what the deck is and you want to find out more, it is a circular deck that is centered in divine feminism and plant life, plant
Mhm.
cycles, and the lunar phases, because it's a round deck and can be read like the lunar phases. So if any of those things interest you, not to mention Sarah Jane's art, to die for. So check that out, tarotofher.com, and come see us on Kickstarter. And then really that's all I have going on right now because it's a lot to run a Kickstarter. It's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
big ordeal. So, all right. Well, if you liked our conversation here today, leave a comment. Tell us what you're thinking about some of the things that we've discussed, or dreams, or fantasies, or imaginations, or anything that might be on your mind. Or actually, if you would love to share a fantasy or a dream that you would like to see in this world, put it into reality, embody it by putting it in the comments below. Of course, you can subscribe to the channel. You can leave a review if you're listening to this as a podcast in audio format, or you can share it with a friend, because I think a lot of the things that we talked about here today are worth sharing with others. And it's actually something that we brought up at the end of the
Hmm.
program. Spread it so that other people can think about contagion in a positive way.
Hmm.
And so get the word out there. All right. Well, I think we have come to the end of a fantastic conversation. Michael always delivers, and I'm so excited that you joined me here again to talk all things that just enliven my mind. So thank you again.
Thank you. It's always so exciting and so nourishing to be in
Hmm.
conversation with you, to see where these ideas take us. And yeah, just so grateful to be back talking with you today.
Well, my Cancer sun has done its job.
Mhm.
All right, everyone. Well, take care out there. Keep dreaming. And as always, may the stars be with you.